Hello, and welcome to today's tutorial where we'll be working on setting up a Raspberry Pi to host Docker containers and then setting up Visual Studio Code on your Windows computer to then look at those files for your Docker containers and work on them on your Windows computer. And as well, we'll also be looking at setting up a FileZilla application for an Sftp to be able to move files back and forth easily between your Pi and your Windows desktop. Now, this can work on any Linux-based operating system, so Raspberry Pi in this case. However, you can also use such as an Amazon EC2 instance, or you can also use some external server that you might have. Any of those could work, but in this case, we'll be using just a Raspberry Pi and a Windows computer. So with that, let's get started. Now the next part of this is going to be actually downloading the Raspbian operating system. And in our case, we're going to use the Buster version. First thing you're going to want to do is go to the link in the description for the old Raspbian versions. So there's an entire page for all the old versions of Raspbian that are available. And the reason you want to go to this page instead of the downloads page is the downloads page only includes the new Raspberry Pi OS, whereas what we need is the Buster OS. So on that page, you're going to see a lot of Raspbian and then dates. In the case of when I'm looking at this, the last one, which is Raspbian 2020-02-14, is the last Buster version available right now. Now you want to go and click on that and you'll see a bunch of options. You want to get the one that says Buster zip. It's a zip file, and download that. Now it will take some time, so in my case I already have it downloaded, and so I can cancel this. And then you want to go and unzip that file and find the image, the Buster image inside of there. Now for me, I'm using the full Buster download. There is a light version that you can use that will not include a desktop. You do not need a desktop for this. However, since I am working on a Raspberry Pi 3B Plus, I'm going to be using the Wi-Fi on that, and so I prefer to have the desktop at least start out. So what I prefer to do is taking the SD card, plugging it in, and hooking the Raspberry Pi up to a keyboard, mouse, and monitor, and setting up SSH and wireless that way, and then unplugging it and then SSHing into the Raspberry Pi from my computer. Now if you have that plugged into Ethernet, then you can just have the command prompt and you don't need the desktop. You can skip that because I just find that easier for myself. However, once you have this image, to get it onto the SD card, you're going to need to download a formatter application. So in this case, we'll be using the Win32 disk imager, and you want to make sure that you have the correct drive selected because you don't want to accidentally write over a separate drive. So in the case of, say you accidentally have a flash drive or a few flash drives plugged in and you have your SD card plugged in, you want to make sure you choose the SD card and not one of your flash drives. And then you want to go and search for your Buster image and then click write, and that should write completely. If there is an error that pops up, because this does happen sometimes, then you want to go into your computer, right click on the SD card and format, and then just reformat that. Then you can write that on Win32. So once that's done, then you can plug the SD card into your Pi and set it up so that way you just want to set it up enough so that it's plugged onto Ethernet. Now if you don't do it the way I do and do a headless version, then you will need to manually set up SSH, and to do that you're going to want to go into the main folder of your SD card and just make an empty file with the name SSH in all caps, and then that once the Raspberry Pi boots up, it will take that file and set the SSH option automatically, so that way you can SSH into it automatically if it's hooked up through Ethernet. And then once that's all done and you can SSH into it, then we'll move on to the next step. Now to SSH into your Pi, you can use either a command prompt or you can use an application such as Putty. And if you want to use Putty and you don't have it, I will have a link in the description to get that application. So when you have it, you can then go and open it up, and you're going to want to type in the hostname or IP address for your Raspberry Pi, In my case, I'll use my host name, which I know is Raspberry Pi. That's the default for all Raspberry Pis. And that'll come up with a message. And for this, you can just click on yes. And then that will boot you into a login screen for your Raspberry Pi. Now, I did change the password for this. And I still have the default username though. So I will say Pi is the username. I'll type in my password. And now we will be SSH'd into your Raspberry Pi. Now, the first thing you're always going to want to do is write sudo apt update to update all the repositories for your Raspberry Pi, and that will take a lot longer for you usually. I've already done that, so that's already done. If that comes up with an error though, saying that it can't find a bus repository, type that in again. This time type --allow-release info-change, and that tells the Pi that it's okay if the release repositories have changed. You still want to grab those, so it will update those for you. And then you want to type in sudo apt upgrade, which it will then take all those repositories and it will come up yes. And then now it'll go through the installation process for all of the software that needs to be installed. Now this will take a long time, so I will be back when this is over. Now that that's finally done, we can go on to setting up other configuration options in Raspberry Pi config. Now, to get into Raspberry Pi config, you're going to want to do sudo raspi-config, and this will get you in so you can change some options. Now, here you can change the host name. So the default is Raspberry Pi. This is what you SSH into, and you also use this to SSH into Visual Studio Code later on. And as well, if you're using web apps, you can use this as the IP in place of the IP in URLs when you go to request web apps. Now you should already have SSH enabled. That would just be if you were doing it in a non-headless setting. You can go and set up SSH that way. And expanding the file system here is more of a quality of life, so that way you can use the entire SD card in case you're working on large development projects, or you could just be working on multiple containers at the same time on Raspberry Pi. You can use the entire SD card then. So that's a good thing to also set up. Now under advanced options, you also could overclock the Raspberry Pi if you want to do that, but that's not necessary in this case. It might be in yours, but for my cases, I will not need to do that. So after you have all that set up, you can click on finish, and it most likely will ask you to restart. You can, and when you do, putty will come up with an error saying that you've been disconnected. That's perfectly fine. When that happens, you can just close out of putty. Next up, we're going to be working on setting up Docker on our Raspberry Pi. So first things first, you're going to want to open putty back up so you can start a new session with the Raspberry Pi that should be restarted by now. And you can type in either the IP again or the host name for the Raspberry Pi and connect. Again, log in as your username and password. And then the first command that you're going to want to do is curl -ssl https get.docker.com, and you want to pipe that into SH. Now, normally you do not want to pipe into SH at all, but since that poses a severe security risk, because then you could be taking any code and running that without checking it. Now, in this case, we do trust get.docker.com, so you can do that. If you want, you can go to that website and download that code yourself, look it over, and run it. Or you can do this, whichever you prefer. This is much quicker though. So we'll run that, and it will pull down all of our code for us. Now this will take a long time, so because of that, I'm going to skip ahead to when this is done. Alright, now when that's done, our next thing we want to do is, the next thing is going to be sudo usermod-ag docker pi, and that's going to be setting our Pi user, our default user, as part of the Docker group. And this needs to happen so that it has permission to run Docker commands. And after this, you're going to have to do a reboot of the Raspberry Pi for that to take effect. And again, you're going to have that same error come up on putty. You can OK, and we'll move on. All right, now that we have Docker installed on the Raspberry Pi, the next step is to check, is it running? So first thing we'll need to do is open up putty again and then SSH into your Pi, sign in with Pi or whatever user and whatever password you have set up as. And the first command that you're going to want to run is groups. And groups will show all the groups that your Pi user is associated with. Now, the one group that you're specifically looking for here is the Docker group. If you see the Docker group, then you know your Pi user is associated with your Docker group, and that's the first sign that you're on the right track. The next sign is to run the hello world test. So run docker run hello world. It'll see that the hello world container is not locally found, so it will download it for you and it'll run it. And your goal is to see the hello from Docker. This message shows that your installation appears to be working correctly. If you can see that at the top of putty there, you know that you have successfully downloaded and installed Docker and it's running on Raspberry Pi correctly. Now from here, you could do whatever you want with the Raspberry Pi in terms of Docker containers. Alright, so the next part is setting up some sort of application you can use to be able to move files back and forth between your Raspberry Pi easily. Now this can be some sort of Sftp server if you want. In my case, I'm going to be using the application FileZilla. So first I'm going to set up a little bit of a test here on the Raspberry Pi. I'm going to create a new test directory in a test file with just some random information in it. And then I'm going to go and open up FileZilla and connect to the Pi. Now the link to download FileZilla will be in the description for you. If I can spell Windows here. Alright, save that. And now I open up FileZilla here. This takes a little bit of time. There we go. Now for the host, you're going to want to type in sftp : / then your host name. So in my case, it's going to be Raspberry Pi. Your username is Pi, and then your password is your Pi password. And then you can click on Quick Connect, and there you go. Now on the left-hand side is my computer, and then on the right-hand side is the Raspberry Pi. So you can see we are now inside of the Pi user. On the right hand side, you can see down the bottom all the files that are in the Pi user if you want to click on one of those to open it up that way. And there we have that test file. So I just go on the left hand side here and make sure that I'm in the right directory. All right. And then it's just as simple as dragging that from the right to the left. And there you go. Now that file is on my Windows computer from my Raspberry Pi. So if I open up a folder, File Explorer here, I'm in that same directory, and there we go. And I notice that I still spelled Windows improperly. So to kind of make a change and show that you can go back and forth, I'll spell Windows correctly here. And then I'll add just another random line underneath that, just as an addition. So I will add this. Alright, save that and close out of there, move the window back. And now, FileZilla, we can just drag from the left to the right. This will come up. You have a few different options. For our case, we want to overwrite, and we don't always want to do this, so we're going to leave those other ones blank just in case, so we don't make a misstep and overwrite something we're not supposed to. Now that file has been written back to the Raspberry Pi. So if we now go back and cat out the test file, you can see one, that Windows has been properly spelled, and that new line is there, which shows that we brought the file over, wrote to it on our Windows computer, and then sent it back to the Raspberry Pi. So with that, you should be able to now work on files on the Raspberry Pi or on the computer, and if there's a file you want to bring over to Windows for whatever reason, to view it or email it or whatever, you can use this FileZilla. Alright, now the final thing that we want to get set up here is Visual Studio Code, and having that integrate with the Raspberry Pi through SSH so you can edit files. Now with working on Windows, you want to make sure that you have OpenSSH installed for Windows. So we're going to open up PowerShell here as an administrator, and this first line here is to check if you have Windows. If not, then it will show, as the second line does for the server option, not present. However, in my case, it says installed. So if it's not present, the OpenSSL client, then what you want to do is you want to run this second line here. And what that'll do is that will actually install OpenSSH client. And you will need that in order to run Visual Studio Code and have it remote SSH into your Raspberry Pi. So now I already have Visual Studio Code installed, so I'm going to open that up, and the first thing you're going to want to do is go to your extensions, and you're going to want to type in remote-SSH, and you see it's the second option there, and you want to install this option. The remote WSL is from my previous tutorial getting this set up, getting Docker set up on Windows. Alright, now that that's installed, you may be prompted to restart Visual Studio Code. If you do, then go ahead, and then you want to type in remote SSH : connect to host. Then you want to type in your username and then your host or IP address. And then when you do that, you can click on enter, and that'll open up a new option. Now, if it cannot detect what operating system you're trying to connect to, it will ask you like it did me there. And so I clicked on Linux, and then since it was a new SSH, then I had to click continue, similar to putty had the warning come up, and you click on continue. Then it's going to prompt me for my password. Now, for every file operation you're going to do to your Raspberry Pi, you will have to put in your password for that. You can set up a credential saver for that, but I will not go into that for this video. I'll just leave it as setting up the having to use a password every time. So then you can see down at the bottom that you have it running and everything. And it will take a while for this to finally connect to the Raspberry Pi, but when it does here, it will show us. There we go, finally connected, and we can close this little pop-up here on the right and close that. And you can see in the bottom left that we have it showing up that we are connected through SSH to Raspberry Pi. And so we can go up to the File Explorer, open a new file or folder, and so it starts us in our home directory. So you want to go into Pi, and then you can go down and you can see what your options are. So in our case, we want to go into test. So we have test down there, and we click connect. Again, as I said before, it will ask you for your password. So put that in, and now you have access to here. So I'm going to open up this file here, and we'll cd in there and cat it out, so that way just you can see that they're both the same right now and what file is actually on there. So I'll make a change to here just to show that you are actually connected to the Raspberry Pi. So add a new line. This was written in Visual Studio Code. Alright, save that. Then go back over to the Raspberry Pi and concatenate that file again. And there you go. The new line was added. So what about creating a new file? So I can do that real quick to show that. So you create a new file, say test_2.txt. And as you can see, not every operation is going to require a new password input. But you can see that it went through just fine in these cases. So saving and creating a new file did not in this case. So with all that said though, you now have the Raspberry Pi set up with Docker. You can SSH into it for a command prompt through putty. You can use FileZilla to send and receive files to the Raspberry Pi, and you can use Visual Studio Code to remote SSH into it to edit, create, or change files. And again, this is set up on the Raspberry Pi. This can very easily be transferred over to, say, an AWS EC2 instance, where on there you might have to use the IP address, or you can set your host file on your Windows computer to have a name for that IP address, or you might use an external server somewhere. You have those options. So with that, thank you very much.